going to scoot over to Regina on camera for Zoom for the intro, and then I will inobtrusively scan back to you, and then I will leave.
Okay. So we're under Lynn's rules, right? We start right at 12 and we end right at 1.
Yes, we are.
Yeah. And what I loved about Lynn, among the many, many things I loved about Lynn, she kept everybody on schedule. I have noon, so we're ready. Okay. Hey everyone, I'm Regina Smith. I teach over in political science, and my research focus is on the post-Soviet, post-communist region. And I'm very pleased today to be introducing to you, presenting to you my colleague, Mikhail Turchenko. Mikhail is extremely well published on public opinion and political behavior in the Russian Federation in this period after 2016-17, when the regime became particularly repressive. He offers us some really interesting insights into what's happening within Russian society. He recently gave a very successful lecture on a similar topic for a program called New Voices in Russian Society, in Russian Studies, in Washington, D.C., which I heard went extraordinarily well. And today he'll be talking to us about a project that we're both working on, which is understanding political attitudes within Russia's wartime diaspora. And I'm sure Mikhail will talk a little bit about the diaspora itself and our research process. So I'll leave that all to him and just present him to you to talk about this work.
Right. Thank you very much, Professor Smith, for this lovely introduction. Today, I'm going to present the preliminary results from an ongoing research project, which has been conducted by Indiana University and Outrush team since March 2023. Well, today I'm going to show you a bunch of data, a huge amount of data, because of the fact that the data is the only things we have. And I will be very appreciative for any of your theoretical comments about the way of how this data could be framed in terms of the political science theories, and also any comments on data, methods, and any general comments are also welcome, more than welcome. Well, a couple of words about background. Since the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24th, 2023, a lot of Russians fled the country because of numerous reasons. There are different estimates. Those estimates tell us that up to 1 million of people fled Russia and did not return back. Well, who are those Russian wartime migrants? Who are those people who fled the country because of the war? Well, if you look at the data collected by the Outrush team and the Levada Center, the nationwide polling organization in Russia, we may see the very distinctive feature of the Russian population. Wartime migrant population. Well, first we see that those people are richer in comparison to the general population. 27 people among the Russian wartime migrants could buy a car in comparison to just 4 per person in the general population. They are much more educated, much higher educated, and they are younger than the population in general. One more thing that should be mentioned about the Russian wartime migrants is that they, besides the fact that they are richer, besides the fact that they are educated, they are much more politically active and much more anti-regime minded than the population in general. So these two graphs show you the results for the opinion polls for the recent Russian parliamentary elections, which were held in 2021. So the left-hand graph, the left-hand picture shows you the voting patterns in the Russian population in general. So we see that approximately a half of the population voted for the pro-governmental, pro-regime, pro-Putin's party, United Russia. But at the same time, in the survey of Russian wartime migrants that was conducted in March, April, and September 2023, where participated more than 4,000 people, only 6 people explicitly say that they voted for the United Russia party during the course of the last Russian parliamentary elections, right? So the main takeaway from this picture is that Russian wartime migrants are absolutely anti-regime minded and protest minded. Well, a couple of words about the research projects within which the results which I'm going to tell today were obtained. Research project called Building a Commons in the Russian Diaspora. It has been conducted by Indiana University and Old-Rush team since March 2023, and it's still ongoing project. Well, a couple of words about the Old-Rush team. It's the team of independent Russian social scientists, mostly sociologists and political scientists, which are currently based, of course, outside the country, outside Russia, in the, universities and institutions as diverse as the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, Tel Aviv University, and the European University Institute of Florence, Italy. Well, this project is built on in-depth interviews with Russian citizens who fled the country because of the war. The main idea was to interview those people who fled the country, who fled Russia and had experience living in 6 particular countries: Armenia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Serbia, Turkey. The main idea is that those countries were the main hubs for Russian wartime migration waves because of the fact that neither of those countries required a visa to enter. And moreover, Kyrgyzstan and Armenia allowed Russian citizens to visit these countries just by internal IDs. The data which I'm going to present today are based on 260 in-person interviews, which I have read in full and coded. But as I said, this ongoing project, and we have already collected more than 550 interviews. We are going to stop this project this month, I guess. Well, a couple of words about the sample. Well, huge amount of respondents from this sample had experience living in Georgia, followed by Turkey, Kazakhstan, Serbia, and Armenia. In just 11 people lived in Kyrgyzstan, the small Central Asian country, because of the fact that the current Kyrgyz authorities are in the close cooperation with the Russian repressive regime, and it's just unsafe for Russian wartime migrants being there for a while. One more thing about the Russian wartime migrants with which I'm working is that it's shown on this slide. As you may see, Russian wartime migrants interviewed in this project are, as in general, young, highly educated. Moreover, even 12 people in our sample had a higher degree, a doctoral degree. And moreover, those people fled the country from the big cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, the most populated, the most important Russian cities. In terms of the gender, the male are a little outnumbered the female because of the fact that some people in our sample fled the country because of the mobilization. Russian authorities announced mobilization in September 2023 in order to, gather more people to the war in Ukraine. And, some people, some male mostly, started to flee the country in order to avoid this mobilization thing. Well, speaking about the reasons to leave the country, in our sample, it's worth mentioning that there are 2 equally important groups in our sample. The first group fled the country because of the mobilization, and the second group of people fled the country because of moral disagreement with the war. It's also important to mention that I coded and created this graph on the respondents' answers, and some respondents, of course, announced different reasons for fleeing the country. And those reasons could be very complicated. For instance, some people could leave the country because of the moral disagreement with the war and simultaneously because of the fear of mobilization, or they could leave the country because of the inability to protest and in order to, in order to protect their friends or relatives. So those motivations stimuli were quite complicated, but in order to, if we collect different stimuli, we will see that the moral disagreement and mobilizations are the most important one. Well, also some Russian wartime migrants were said about their desire to return. As you may see, our sample was divided pretty evenly between the people who say that they are not going to return to Russia any longer because of the fact that this country betrayed us, and some more people 86 people say that yes, they would like to return to the country. For instance, if the political regime will be changed and Putin will die, and reasons like that. 42 more people remained unclear about their decision to return to the country or not. Well, why do Russian wartime migrants' opinion important in understanding in answering the questions about the future Russian institutional structure and about the transitional justice? Well, so first of all, Russian wartime migrants are, have insider knowledge about the political, economic, and societal structures in the Russian system. Most of those people are highly educated. Moreover, Russian wartime migrants usually are very politically active back in home, and moreover, some of those people were victims of the previous regimes. For instance, 50 people among 216 which testimonies I have analyzed reported some experience with the political repression. Some of those people were detained. Against some of those people, the criminal cases were opened back in Russia. Some of those people faced with the police brutality taking part in the peaceful protest actions, including anti-war protest actions being in Russia. Well, so now I'm going to move directly to the main research results I gathered from this survey in the year. Well, in order to understand the Russian wartime migrants' opinions toward the political institutions, the following question was asked to the people. As a rule, this question was asked only to those people who openly reported their desire to return to the country. But as a rule, it was up to the interviewer to whom to ask this question. This is why not 260 people responded to this question, but only 124. Well, speaking about the political reforms and reforms of political institutions, which are, very important for the future post-authoritarian, post-Putin Russia, an enormous amount of people, a huge amount of people say that the justice restoration is the most silent, the most important, the most significant topic, followed by the creation of new political institutions, restoration of free and fair elections, introducing some civil and political rights, etc., etc. Well, let's look more deeply on this, the most important, the most silent political issue, the justice restoration. As one of our respondents say, Russia, current Russia is a hugely unjust society. Now the huge problem is that we live in a very unjust society. So by this category of justice restoration, people usually mention the following reforms: law reform, court reform, transitional justice, release of political prisoners, policy reform, and face-based dismissal. Well, all of those reforms somehow related to the improvement of Russian legal system and the law enforcement system. It's interesting to know at this point is that 22 people answering to this open-ended question mentioned that some forms of transitional justice are very important for the future Russia. Well, what is transitional justice? In scholarly literature, transitional justice is considered as the set of tools and set of mechanisms which could be employed against the former authoritarian elite and their collaborators after the transition to democracy, right? So this is the main idea behind the transitional justice. So those people who were committed to the human rights violations and human rights abuse, who were committed to the war criminals, should be held accountable. This is the main idea behind transitional justice. Well, speaking about transitional justice, all Russian wartime migrants, except those who mentioned openly transitional justice while answering the question about political reforms, were asked the following question. In your opinion, does Russia need a special policy for people who collaborated or held public office under Vladimir Putin's regime? And if so, what should it be? So, in other words, all of our respondents were asked openly about the transitional justice. Results are the follows. Well, a huge amount of Russian people are arguing for some sorts of transitional justice against those people who collaborated with Putin regime. Only 8 people say that there are no need for any forms of transitional justice, but not because of the fact that those people should be, given a mercy, but because of the fact that those 8 people mentioned that any sorts of transitional justice can provoke some sort of backlash and some negative consequences to the Russian politics and society, which we should should avoid as much as possible. And 16 more people remained unclear answering this question, saying that we are not an expert to answer this question, or it's a very complicated question, or we don't, did not think about it and cannot give you an answer, in this particular moment. Well, speaking about the transitional justice, most of the people mentioned war criminals. Different people understand war criminals differently, but as a rule, people mention the war criminals, those who are openly in charge of the war against Ukraine, and those who, given the orders to kill civilians, who executed those orders. Usually people do not specify whom they consider to be war criminals, but some people did specify and mentioned either Putin himself or his, close circle, those people who are held in the top positions in the Russian government. And some other people mentioned mercenaries like a Wagner group, notorious Wagner group, and some other people mentioned just, rank and file Russian soldiers. This group followed by the security apparatus, mostly from FSB. FSB is a Russian Federal Service Security. It's the successor of the former KGB, Soviet-style KGB. And Putin himself is just worked in the KGB for a while. Well, followed by the top civil officials, propagandists, fellow citizens, judges, bureaucracy, and teachers, even school teachers, mostly. Well, speaking about any transitional justice instruments to be employed, again, those people, Russian wartime migrants usually discussed two broad categories of those measures: lustration and purges and trials. Well, at this point, it's very important to clarify what, at least in a scholarly literature, means under the term lustration. Lustration is the set of mechanisms and procedures to reveal the secret collaborators with the former authoritarian regimes, mostly with the former secret services, right? At the same time, purges is slightly different phenomena. Purges is about removal from offices those people who openly collaborated with the regime. So to give you an example, it's no need to take some lustration toward those people who are holding any governmental posts in the Russian, in the Russian state, because those people are well known. It's no need to, say that those people collaborated with the regime because they're open collaborators. But it makes sense to purge them, right? But at the same time, if the people, if some people work covertly for federal security services, so it makes sense to know who those people are. It makes sense to impose those people with lustration. Also, some Russian wartime migrants argued for trials against the former Putin's regime supporters. Well, speaking about the linkages between those targets of transitional justice and those mechanisms, you may see that the war criminals, speaking about war criminals, Russian wartime migrants usually argue for trials. You may see this by this green line. Speaking about security apparatus and high-profile officials, Russian wartime migrants usually argue for any lustration or purges. Usually people did not distinguish between those two categories at some reason. Speaking about propagandists, those people who are in charge of spreading the hate speech across the Russian media, Russian wartime migrants usually argue for, again, trials rather than lustration or purges. It's interesting that, speaking about fellow citizens, those citizens who not just actively participated in the war or in the Putin's crimes, but those citizens who, just supported the Putin's regime or supported this aggressive war against Ukraine, Russian wartime migrants were arguing mostly about the informational campaigns and creation of some truth commissions, which could, educate those people and provide them the information about the pillars of Putin's regime and the real purposes behind this war. Well, this slide shows you some quotations from our interview project. So actually, in those quotations, people are saying basically the same as I demonstrated in the previous slide. Trials against war criminals and some lustration purges against the top civil officials and security apparatus. It's interestingly to mention that, speaking about rank and file regime servants like grassroots bureaucracy and low-placed civilians, Russian wartime migrants are very cautious about any transitional justice instruments, saying that those instruments to be employed against this huge number of people who, just worked for the Russian bureaucracy would be very harmful for the Russian state, because of the fact that it could, provoke some sort of backlash, or because of the fact that, this is it will be just, creation of the huge class of people who will be deprived from civil and political rights, which is kind of unfair for the future Russian future. While discussing and while speaking about some transitional justice instruments, Russian wartime migrants highlighted the idea is that we should treat and we should employ those mechanisms very easily, with the ultimate goal not to just, just to punish the people, but with the ultimate goal to restore a democratic political institutions in order to restore the legal system, in order to restore the justice back in the country. Right, but at the same time, of course, some people, a minority of people, to be honest, say that they are very angry about those people who collaborated with Putin regime, and they would like to see them, punished very severely. Well, the main takeaways from my talk is that the data which I gathered at this point show that the lack of justice is the most silent political issue, at least among the Russian wartime migrants. Traditional justice mechanisms should target war criminals, high-profile officials, security apparatus, and propagandists, but at the same time, Russian wartime migrants are not big supporters of any traditional justice mechanisms about rank-and-file regime servants. Well, an important caveat about this data and these results are in order. This caveat is that while conducting this survey, we, of course, could not, reach any sort of representativeness, right? So those data are not representative. So it's the very most important point. The ideas of Russian wartime migrants toward both political changes and toward the transitional justice do not represent the ideas of Russian population in general, and even Russian wartime migrants en masse. Mostly because of the fact that no one knows what's the, the socio-economical structure of the Russian wartime migrant population. But in my opinion, these data can, show us and show us the main paths for the future political reforms in the country and the way of how the transitional justice could be employed. Well, thank you very much for your attention. This is the end of my talk, and I will be very appreciated for any of your comments, your theoretical comments, any suggestions, and maybe some questions about the data. Thank you very much.
So I should also say that in addition to doing this compelling personal research, Mikhail has been instrumental in actually collecting these data. This has been an enormous project. I think we're actually up to about, including some auxiliary interviews, 600 interviews. And even though it's not representative, it's fairly dense, and it's matched to 3 waves of surveys. So we have really weighty data that we hope to build upon. So that's why presenting early at this stage, the preliminary work for your comments is so important. So, yeah.
I have a couple of questions. One is more directly related. So, those who escape are largely young, educated, rich. So it is kind of a loss for the Russian state, but they're also, from what I said from you, they're also mostly dissidents. So maybe after all, Putin is very happy that they left, because now he has less opposition there, even though there is a price, but maybe it is a positive thing for the regime. And the second question is more broad, and I don't know if even possible to answer. I mean, do you see any good prospects for a regime change along the way, but also if you compare Russia now to how it was in the Soviet Union and in the 90s, is it on a track of improvement or the same or worse? If you're looking at long-term trends, what do you see?
Yeah, thank you very much for your questions. Well, answering the first question, is the Putin happy seeing an enormous amount of Russians fleeing the country? Well, I see that he is definitely happy seeing that. And this is probably the main reason why the Russian state authorities still have Russian borders to be opened for and transparent for the people. Well, but at the same time, because of the fact that the Russian economy used to be deeply connected with the, the world economy and including the technological sector, Russian officials are not very happy seeing IT specialists fleeing the country, and now the Russian government is trying to lure those people back to the country. But speaking about the dissidents, like social scientists or probably human rights activists, journalists, so of course the Russian government, love seeing those people in exile. Well, answering your second question, well, you're right, it's a very broad question, and I can answer this question only based on my expertise in Russian politics rather than the data we occurred in this research project. As probably every probably every dictatorship, current Russian state is based on the three pillars, which are propaganda, which are some sort of economic stimuli, and which are repression. Well, now we may see that the Russian economy worked well than it was expected right after the war started. So despite the inflation, despite some sort of economic hardship, it's still operating and it still provides people with some goods, especially those people who work for the state. The current Russian state is relying more and more, as time went by, for repression, including very tight repression against the civil society and just ordinary people. And of course, the Russian state is based hugely on propaganda, state propaganda. Well, if you look at the Russian state right now, we will see that all of those three mechanisms are working together and working well, unfortunately. And it brings me to the conclusion that probably current Putin's Russia can exist even longer without any abrupt political changes which we cannot predict from this point of time. Well, so.
I just had a really quick, this is fantastic. What a heavy lift. Oh my gosh, right? I can't even imagine. So just two quick things. One is I noticed that right now the draft as it stands doesn't really talk much about the existing Russian constitution. And it strikes me that somewhat like, to a lesser degree, like China's, it's a relatively liberal document in and of itself. So I'm wondering, as you think about transitional justice opportunities, like, is there anything that you could couch or like hang your hat on from the Constitution itself that could help with rule of law reform? If there was a dissident group locally, or if the expats, do gain more sway over time, is there some provision, is there some mechanism in place that would allow for the types of, outcomes that could be seen here that wouldn't be extra constitutional? And just another point that we raised before was, to what degree can you use AI to help with some of this, right? Because it's just such a huge data set. I'm wondering, are there any tools that IU's made available so far, or that we could help with, finding that could maybe make this that much more useful? Because as you say, there's a lot there, right?
So let me add that this is the goal of keeping Mikhail here for another year.
Yeah, right.
It's to literally do this kind of more sophisticated text as data analysis with this incredibly rich data set. And we're having some good success, and I feel really lucky, but we can talk.
Oh yeah.
Go ahead.
Thank you very much for your question. So answering your first question, you are absolutely right that the Russian Constitution has some provisions that prohibit aggressive war, that prohibit the censorship, that prohibit the limitation of civil and political rights. Another question is just those provisions just don't work in a Putin's Russia because it's just absolutely lawless state. It's not a coincidence that a lot of Russian wartime migrants were arguing for their justice restoration because the law is just unworking in Russia. For instance, the tricky thing about the Russian constitution is just this constitution openly prohibits the existence of any mercenary groups. Any mercenary groups are just prohibited, but at the same time, even the Putin itself acknowledged the existence of those groups, which is kind of weird. Well, so to make a long story short, yes, Russian constitution as well as the Russian criminal code and just Russian legal system in general have some provisions that could be used in order to hold accountable those people who collaborated with the Putin's regime. But well, yes. Answering your second question about AI, I totally agree with Professor Smith that probably must be the second step in this research project in order to see some connections between the sentiments in the migrants' testimonies, in order to understand how those sentiments are connected with each other. Probably it will help us, to build some sort of theories, but this is why I'm so looking for any of your comments toward the theoretical part of this research. Yes, it will be the second stage of the project.
1, 2. Please tell us.
Yeah, so I think kind of in some sense I was thinking closer to your final comment is so where are you heading this? Okay, because if you think historically, I cannot find a lot of examples in which expatriated dissidents have a lot of power in modifying the regime of a country. So essentially, again, so one option is, hey, I don't care about Russia itself. I care about this population, wherever they go, and then how they interact with the domestic people, where they migrated. Okay, so if that's the case, well, that's one thing. But I don't think you're going to learn a lot about Russia. Essentially, you're going to learn how people interact with local. How they integrate into local places of migration. Okay, again, I think I would push you in a different direction. It's like, is there any interesting mechanism through which these guys affect maybe not Russia, but the perception that countries where they migrate have about Russia? So, and I don't have an answer, but I think that's a more interesting question from my perspective, okay? And then I would also separate some things that are general for any migrant. So essentially, usually migrants tend to be wealthier, more educated, they tend to know more about, so that's a general thing. That's not specific about Russian migrants. I could go and say, what is specific about these guys that is different from any type of money? If you go and check migration flows to many countries, it tends to be like that. So essentially, again, I don't have more specific ideas of how to go, but more kind of a comment of where I would love to see this project going anyway. But just my opinion.
Right, Gustavo, thank you very much for all of your comments. I see that it's very interesting to see how the migrants are communicated with the host societies, like how those host societies are inclined or not inclined to see those peoples in there. And actually, this project is not just asking the people about the political reforms and transitional justice.
Yeah.
It's a huge project, and we have a huge interview guides, which eventually includes a bunch of questions about the way of how the Russian wartime migrants got acquainted with the local communities, how do they communicate with them, which problems they have while interacting and working with those communities. And we have a just big research team, speaking honestly, not just me and the Professor Smith, but a bunch of other people who are working on those questions. And I totally
24 people on our team
Oh, well,
altogether,
yes,
including researchers and directors.
Right. And I totally see your point, but at least in this project, there are a bunch of people, mostly from the European University Institutes, who are studying the interaction between the Russian wartime migrants and the local communities. Right. My research interest in this research project is rather about, asking about the political reforms and any transitional justice mechanisms. I absolutely agree with you that probably there are no research who ever covered those topics. That's absolutely right. I did my homework and I tried to figure out who else wrote about that. I just failed to do that. And moreover, the field of transitional justice is an emerging field, speaking honestly. So people are just trying to figure out how those transitional justice mechanisms should be studied, how they should be, incorporated in a broad research discussion inside the political science. So I know that there is the big specialist from the University of Chicago, who is Monica Nalepa, who is now using the quantitative data to study those transitional justice. And, by using this qualitative approach, I'm just, trying somehow to align my own research interests with these broad discussions. So.
Can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
That's okay.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it.
So what if you push these peoples with more kind of harsher trade-off? It's like say, okay, we can do transitional justice and put some of these war criminals in jail, but that will require some serious invasion and bombing of Russia. What do you do? And I think it's essentially, let's say that you try to see how they trade off patriotism with liberal values. Right. So that is, it's again, I don't know. Then you may start finding that they agree with these things when they cost nothing, but when you start putting a cost tag to these things, now suddenly say, well, I don't know. So you see, that could be very costly to change things in this direction, or it will require some kind of serious economic and political turnout closer to the transition from communism to out of communism, which was a severe economic crisis for Russia. So let's say, are you willing to pay that cost to get rid of the Putin's regime?
Well, that's a very interesting question.
So I don't know, and I don't know the answer, but I would love to see those things, those answers to those questions.
Yeah, and it's interesting comment. I have just remembered the book written by Yossi Shane from the Yale University, who is currently a professor of Tel Aviv University, along with Juan Lins. He wrote, no, it was just a solo book. He wrote a solo book where he, exactly explored the interactions between the dissidents and their home countries in the period of the war, looking mostly on the historical examples. Yes, your question could, add to the discussion from the current data. But the main idea actually in this project is just try to align the results which I got from the migrants' testimonies to the already existed research outputs. For instance, the Monica Lepa, which I have already mentioned here, came to the conclusion that based on the quantitative data, that it would be profitable for post-authoritarian societies to make some sort of illustration, widespread spread illustration, in order to know all of those hidden collaborators with the regime, in order to the former agents of repression will not be able to somehow to blackmail them. But at the same time, speaking about purges, it's very tricky thing, purges, because while removal people from office, you can remove the very experienced and highly educated guys which could serve for the new government, right? And while asking the Russian wartime migrants about those issues, I received in these qualitative results approximately the same results, which is quite interesting, not least from my perspective at this point. So
I would even ask in the opposite way. It's what if a transition to a good liberal regime requires an amnesty law so those guys will not go to jail? I think most Russians would say yes, let's go.
Probably yes, but the theoretical perspectives say that it's a bad idea.
So I just want to push back on two things. One is that diaspora is a hugely important component in many transitions when transitions happen. And transition is not going to come only by violence, right? Transition in Russia could come if Putin dies tomorrow. He died 5 times last week. So we'll see how transition comes. There's a lot of opposition going on in Russia right now that you all are unaware of because it's really hard to study and quantify. So, and there's a lot of disruption in the society because of this diaspora. Families who have been disentangled with their children, changing familial relationships. There's a huge pile of remittances going back and forth in both directions. The connections are much bigger than you're characterizing here. And really, if you look at the post-Soviet space in 1990, 89, 91, there was quite a bit of diaspora influence over lustration processes in the Czech Republic, in Poland, in Hungary, and none in Russia. This diaspora in Russia is different from the past. And these are the kind of questions that, as Mikhail puts it in comparative context, is going to really tell us a lot about the evolution of Russian society between 1991 and 2023 that I find just really insightful and exciting. So I'm going to defend and argue for his project, which I find very compelling.
I'm not defending this because I'm just trying to.
Yes, no, I know, but I want to step in and say that I think you're underselling the importance of this particular question.
Thank you.
Yeah, go.
Okay, I have a handful of questions, but most of them are on sort of methodological approach. So the interviews, obviously you did a lot of, there's a lot and continue to be more in-depth interviews and semi-structured interviews happening. Are these in person? Are they telephone? Or how? Tell me, I'm curious about these interviews because I'm also curious on sort of the responses that people are giving and how they may feel pressured possibly to give certain responses, or maybe they're concerned that their identity may get released and then there can be repercussions on that sense. So yeah, I'm really curious about the interview process and who your participants are, and then how free they are to give accurate, or what, I guess, true, not that they're not telling you the truth, but like, full responses.
Absolutely great, amazing methodological question. Thank you very much for asking it. Well, we recruited our respondents by two different waves. The first wave of recruitment comes from the Outrush team. Right after the war started, those independent social scientists, Russian social scientists, started to collect contact information of those Russians who fled the country right after the war started.
Yeah, right.
Those people were mostly with activist background because of they fled the country because of most of them had fears of the first days, or because they feared that they could be prosecuted for their political activity back home. Well, so it was our first way of recruitment. We used those contact information which were collected by this Outrush team in the very first days after the war started. And the second wave of recruitment was snowball recruitment. So we asked just our first respondents whom they could recommend, and we reached those people. Well, we used a secure channel to conduct those interviews. All of those interviews were conducted online, and we had a very strict, secure protocol by which both interviewer and interviewee, our respondent, should be outside of Russia during the course of the interview in order to protect the data and the data collection process. We did not allow our interviewers to keep any information on their personal laptops or computers. The whole interactions were through the Microsoft Teams. So speaking honestly, we have very, very secure the protocol. And as for the Russian wartime migrants data, we anonymized all our respondents, but during the course of the interviews, both neither an informant, neither interviewers did know each other. Right, so they did know how they look like, what are their names, and like that. And of course, sometimes Russian wartime migrants introduce themselves, interviewers themselves too. But the Russian wartime migrants had an option not to switch the video, not to disclose their real names, and just to stay as secure as only possible. So this is the main details of this interview project. But there are a lot of those details, technical details. Speaking of,
can I just add that IU has a wonderful service called the IU Secure My Research. And they help you think through from the beginning to the end how to protect people from data breaches, but also how to protect them and be anonymous to decrease the pressure. And the reason we conducted these things online behind the IU paywall, so the protection wall, so nothing happened that nothing was downloaded to individual computers, everything stayed in the cloud, things were anonymized before being saved, and it was all through MS Teams because that was the safest way. So that was our choice, to do it through, instead of face-to-face, but over MS Teams.
Okay, so this leads, I find it, I mean, this is obviously really important research, and I find it fascinating. And then, to a specific point on some of your data, you classify people as like having a reason for migrating. But then my question is like, why did you choose like a reason? Because they could have multiple reasons. And so is there a way that you could have multiple, this, we did it one way, and now this is another way we do it, where they have two reasons to be, to have migrated, and then you can run some chi-square test or, MANOVAs to sort of compare. I don't know.
You are absolutely right. And sometimes, as I said, many of our respondents disclosed different reasons for why they decided to flee the country. Not just one, not just two, maybe 3, 4, or even 5. It was just up to our informant to say as many reasons for the fleeing the country as only possible. More as the interviews went by, those people can recall some other reasons, or they could refine those reasons which they stated in the very beginning of the whole process. So, well, the short answer to the question is that we just did not have a question what was your reason, just one reason. We have just question, why did you decide to flee the country? Or probably, I do not correctly remember this.
I may have misunderstood. Okay, so when you shared that graph, I thought you had like, you classified everybody as like, this is their reason. And so I could have misunderstood.
You're right. It's my bad, my mistake. Yeah, some people could choose as many reasons as only possible. It was just open-ended.
Okay, so somebody might be in several of those categories.
Right. One person could say, and it was general common story that like these particular people, they fled the country because of mobilization and simultaneously because of moral disagreement and inability to protest. So it's
Gotcha.
yeah.
So I will say we've just written, I don't think Mikhail's seen it, but our team is producing policy memos from these data. And what we find is, whereas in past Russian migrations, economic considerations were primary, in this migration, it's very difficult to tease out economic from political reasons for leaving. And so that this moral component is much more prominent here than in others. So I have those. If you want to see them, I can.
Yeah, I'm curious if like you can email them or something.
Sure, absolutely.
Fascinating. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you both.
Hi, well, thank you so much. I mean, it was really important, amazing, and personal research. The title of your project was Building a Commons in the Russian Diaspora. So as no surprise, since that's my thesis is commons making and commons building, I get to see that part in the presentation. So what commons, I can imagine, but what kind of commons what are you building?
Do you want me to say, because it's my title, or do you want to say?
Yeah, you wasn't sure.
The initial grant for the project was my work. And one of the things that you see very interestingly, and the initial question was, would this diaspora movement become an engaged and active anti-war, anti-Putin force in the world, both educating people in the host countries, talking to US government officials, communicating, and so forth. So in that sense, one of the congruent parallel tracks of literature is, in the diaspora literature, there's a question, what is a diaspora? So a diaspora is not just a group of people living outside the country, but a community with attributes that match very closely to Lynn's idea of, what commons is defined, having those attributes of common identity, networks, common goals, hierarchy, rules of governance, and so forth. And so this project was really initially, this is not Mikhail's piece, this is my piece, right? So although he's working with me on it, is can we look at the preconditions of activism as this community defines itself as a commons, as a community, with the collective good being influencing politics abroad, and now, interestingly, in Russia, right? And also, interestingly, influencing politics in the EU and in the US, because these folks are the first politically, and I disagree that they're all dissidents. They're not all dissidents. Many of them are common people who simply showed up at a protest at some point. That's not formally a dissident. But these people are now rejected both by Russia and by the West. And now they're having to be politically active, both agitating for, as Hannah Arendt wrote, the right to have rights in the West, and also to influence politics in Russia. And to me, this overlap between diaspora politics and commons politics and collective action is really striking. And that's the piece that I've been writing right now. Mikhail's collecting quotes from the data to sort of illustrate how this process is happening. It's fascinating. And I think it's a really important sort of new take on how to think about diaspora. Thanks to Lynn. So that's how it came.
That makes sense. So
yeah, I think it's really exciting. The more I think about it, the more excited I get. I'm so happy to be an homage to Lynn.
Any location? Any location? Are clusters of people in specific locations?
Mhm. So yeah, so people are clustering in specific countries. Mikhail has a chart, the places where they're. So we picked our interview sites in place for, we picked really 6 important countries, interview sites, because they're places where people are going because visa regulations are easy.
Yeah.
2 are close to being in the EU, are EU member, Turkey and Serbia. 2 are in the Caucasus, Georgia and Armenia. And then we're really concentrating on 2 cities in Kazakhstan so we can control for national conditions and look at differences across cities. And that was really to start to think about the effect of host country attitudes on political behavior.
Do they live close by? So I know that.
Do they live? Yeah.
So essentially, or because they can live in the same city and then essentially they are not in the community there, or maybe they live in different places, but they have an activity that they, put them together. So I'm thinking about this component of community associated with the idea of diaspora. Yeah. So it's did you see some of those features?
Well, I can answer the question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Actually, well, despite the fact that it was not my primal interest to see the building on those particular communities in any particular place, like in cities and like that, but because I have read all of those 260 interviews, I noticed some interesting patterns in the building of those communities. Probably the most tense, the most successful communities were built in the Tbilisi, Georgia, the capital city of Georgia, because of the interesting fact is that a lot of people migrated to Tbilisi, Georgia, right after the war started, and those people were not just the people who feared the war. Those people were most of the time independent journalists, human rights activists, even former politicians, and because of their background, they created very dense communities there, speaking honestly. Well, and probably the less successful communities, the poor organized communities, were in Kyrgyzstan, because of the fact that the intention of Kyrgyz state authorities to prosecute and press the people, Russian activists, just preventing them from continuing their work, because the Kyrgyz authorities very densely collaborated with their Russian colleagues, and some grassroots organizations were just brutally forced by the Kyrgyz secret services. This is why in both Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan, because it's also authoritarian state, the activities of the Russian population were very, very limited. They were very flourished. They thrives in the more or less democratic countries like Georgia, and to the less extent in Serbia and Turkey.
Also, can I just add that we are using the World Bank social capital tool to kind of map the communities and look at the nature of the interaction. So I was just in Serbia. I went to cafes that Russians have started where they congregate. Thanks to Vasilisa, sent me a list of them and I could go and look at them. Grocery stores, neighborhoods, talk to people about how they're buying land as a path to citizenship. And yes, they're afraid. They're very afraid to be politically active in Serbia, very afraid. But they're also very active in building community, self-help organizations, artistic expressions like coffee houses where they're doing anti-Putin stand-up comedy, for example. So these things are happening. It's a really dense community, but it's not an especially politically active community in the sense of being anti-war, pro-democracy, because recently people have been deported from Serbia for being active.
I have another question. Maybe it is beyond the research that you already did, but if you can compare, I mean, Russia has a history of dissidents. 1900. I mean, they're the early 20th century. They are freed from the Tsar, especially after the 1905 revolution, and then from the Soviet Union, and now from Putin. So there were like communities of Russian dissidents in different periods, and I don't know if you can compare how different they are in terms of which people are going outside and what they do once they leave?
Well, it's very interesting question, speaking honestly, and I'm not a big expert answering this question. I know that probably the most prominent first migration flow from it was straight after the communists took power in 1917 approximately. Well, it was mostly those people who supported the Russian Empire and the former intelligentsia who fled the country. And being abroad, they indeed tried somehow to create any political groups which could influence on what's going on inside the Soviet Union. They ultimately failed, unfortunately. Well, there were the migration wave from the Soviet Union, of course, that consisted mostly from either from dissidents, which were just very, very small number of dissidents, and mostly from the Jewish population who fled the country because of some sort of persecutions there.
I think there was a failed coup attempt on the Tsar, I think in 1905 or so. Wasn't there a failed coup attempt against the Tsar in 1905, something like that?
But that didn't lead to a big migration. Actually, it was after 1917.
I mean, I know there are a few, but I don't know how many fled because there was a forced repression after that.
I have a suggestion that connected to Ethan. Can I go? I think Ethan's point could be very interesting in the following sense. What if you compare respondents of previous Russian communities? So in Israel, for example, we have Russians that migrated to Israel, but before the war. So what do they think about the same issues compared to the new immigrants? So the wartime immigrants versus Russian immigrants before the war. That could be an interesting comparison, no?
It would be an interesting question. I agree. There are some preliminary, so I have preliminary hypothesis about this comparison. This comparison is that this migration flow from Russia will consist of much more active people who are much more involved in politics in comparison to the previous migration law, for instance, to the Israel and other countries, because those people who fled Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union migrated solely, in most parts, solely because of economic reasons, in order to find a better life. But at the same time, it's not the case for most of the people who fled the country right now. It's interesting, but I love the idea of comparison people inside those which we have already interviewed on different categories, like based on how do they consider the political reforms and traditional justice based on their activist background or the lack of theory of how do they consider, so to what extent they consider that transitional justice or political reform should be implemented based on these factors and any other factors. So there are a lot of comparative potential in the data which I have at this point.
And there is data. So the US government conducted 2 huge interview projects with Soviet migrants, one right after World War II and one in the 1980s. These data have just been released, they're available, and I'm really hoping to convince someone that's a great dissertation. Right, to use our data and the past data and think about those differences.
Nice. So maybe no 1905 as Ethan, but that's Second World War. That's
And actually, if I follow up on him, so in Israel you have a couple of population. You have those who fled who fled like in 1990. So all they know was the Soviet Union. They don't know personal experience. They know the Soviet Union with everything it was, not Russia. And then you have those that came later and they experienced the Soviet Union and the new Russia. And then you also have those who came after the war in Ukraine. So they have different experience of what Russia is.
And these waves of people are in this Soviet interview project of the 1980s, at least. Remember, this was the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, right? To pressure Russia to allow Jews who wanted to emigrate, who were being prosecuted, to be able to leave. This was a big part of why we imposed Jackson-Vanik, for those of us old enough, maybe only me, to actually remember. So I do think this is really a fruitful way to think about the world, and not only in Israel, in the United States as well. There are huge Russian communities that are largely apolitical until Trump, when they re-engage politics, right,
Mhm.
on the side of the strong leader. So there's some very interesting things that can be done here, I think. And I was just in Serbia, and there is a big 1917 diaspora group that came from the nobility, and they have no contact with the new Russians. I talked to some people in that group, and they want nothing to do with it. They have their nice quiet life. They still maintain some heritage Russian identity. They speak Russian, but they're not, those groups don't interact.
Mhm. Mhm.
It's interesting.
Super interesting.
Cool.
Um,
We have 2 minutes by
Yeah,
the
right.
Lynn rule.
Thank you so much for give me a clarification about diaspora. I never heard this term before,
Oh, yeah.
but now I know what is that. And I have a question because it's fascinating. Your research, it seems like action research because the topics you said building, right? It personally, it makes me thinking about you try to build something in action. Could you please explain something about the idea of the life cycle of this research project? I just wondering what is the outcome or ultimate outcome of this program?
Yeah, so political science, we all know political science is not great at process, right? And I love a good statistic, but this isn't the right method for this exploration. So as Mikhail said, this started, it takes a long time to get grant funding. We did this within 6 months. We were still late to the game. But so we now have in our entire team 3 waves of data, and there'll be at least 1 more, maybe 2 more waves of survey data. And within that survey data, there is a panel study where they're recontacting the same people, which gives them very sophisticated tools, and also embedded survey experiments. So there are survey experiments embedded in the waves. Our interview data has been going on for about a year. Took us almost a year. It took us a long time to get into the field. It was very hard to figure out how to just pay people to do the interviews because we wanted native Russian speakers, right? But those people are themselves in exile and subject to sanctions, and there was a lot of investigation. It was very, very difficult, much more than we anticipated. We had to make all of them affiliates of IU in order to get behind the wall. So I think the reason that the team is so big is it will produce research on several different topics. There's work going on about remittances. There's work going on about transitional justice. There's really fascinating work happening about transnational repression and Russia's attempt to silence these people by pressuring host countries or directly intervening with them. I am working on a book. We just got a book contract. I'm so excited. It's called Reclaiming Dignity, Russians Between Putin and the West, about how people are redefining their Russianness, their Russian identity, being attacked from all sides and feeling, and what the idea of collective responsibility means and what their strategies are. So it's going to be a very multi-pronged project. And I'll end with this. The most exciting thing to me is I think we're setting a standard for diaspora research in terms of the complexity of the data. So there will be, I hope, 2 really important methodologic papers. One that says, how do we do mixed methods work with surveys and interviews? And one that looks at the use of AI and text as data with the interview data, which has been really right now quite limited because almost no one has this depth of data. And so that's what I'm really excited about here, that we're both contributing to the social science of diaspora studies and we're doing policy implications and the thing. So, okay.
Brilliant.
Little long, thanks you guys. Thank you, Mikhail. That was great. You're right, I did present.
No.
No, when I started off, they were teasing me that I didn't know I was presenting, but
Just so you know.
I always, I'm so